Have you ever heard $300 million evaporate in the blink of an eye? It is not an explosion. It is the haunting hiss of thousands of thermal pipes rupturing under pressure, choking an entire tech empire in toxic smoke. I stood there, sipping a premium espresso, watching my arrogant new boss trigger a federal cybersecurity disaster. Let me tell you how I legally weaponized his hubris to destroy his career. Hello, listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Thank you so sincerely for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff to cover their living expenses and continue creating more stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or comments below. My name is Harper Rivera. I am 32 years old, and until recently, I was the lead cloud systems architect at Aegis Nexus Solutions. We were not just another server farm. We were a colossal artificial intelligence data center sprawling across the dusty, sun-baked outskirts of Austin, Texas. Aegis was not running simple web hosting or storing vacation photos. We were the digital heartbeat of the entire state's infrastructure. If you rode in an autonomous vehicle anywhere from Dallas to Houston, our servers processed your navigation and telemetry in real time. More importantly, we handled a highly classified, critical portion of the energy distribution data for the United States Department of Energy. In my world, there is no room for error or second-guessing. We operated on a strict, non-negotiable policy of zero latency and absolute, impenetrable security. A delay of a few milliseconds could mean widespread power grid failures or catastrophic traffic collisions on the highways. Hardware of that sheer magnitude and processing power generates an ungodly, dangerous amount of heat. You do not just plug in a giant fan, blast the air conditioning, and hope for the best. To keep a facility like Aegis running, you have to fight the laws of thermodynamics every single second of the day. For 5 years, I kept those towering rows of server racks freezing cold and ruthlessly efficient. I personally designed and built our dynamic thermal balancing algorithm. From absolute scratch, it was a beautiful, intricate dance of physics and machine code, autonomously managing miles of high-grade liquid cooling pipes that circulated specialized, highly conductive chemical coolants straight through the server core blocks. I was proud of my work. Over those 5 years of continuous operation, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we never experienced a single pressure drop or thermal throttling event, not one. I knew every pressurized valve, every biometric sensor, and every microscopic thermal threshold like the back of my hand. My control room was a sanctuary of quiet, focused discipline. It was a symphony of humming silicon and flashing green indicators that proved everything was perfectly balanced and exactly where it needed to be. I treated my servers with the respect you would give to a ticking bomb, and in return, they gave me flawless performance. But silence and stability are fragile things in the corporate world. My perfect, precisely tuned ecosystem was shattered into pieces the day an aggressive venture capital firm swept into town. They bought out the original founders, dissolved the old management structure, and completely overhauled the executive board overnight. To protect their new investment, they brought in Vance Sterling to be our brand new chief executive officer. Vance was the living, breathing epitome of the Silicon Valley tech bro stereotype, transplanted right into the heart of Texas. He strutted into my highly sensitive server farm, wearing obscenely expensive black turtlenecks in the middle of summer, always carrying a sleek tablet displaying absolutely meaningless vanity growth charts. He was a man utterly obsessed with optics rather than actual operations. His entire vocabulary consisted of hollow, recycled buzzwords he probably picked up from reading motivational posts on social media. During his very first tour of the facility, he spent the entire time talking loudly about synergistic paradigm shifts, hyperscaling our cloud footprint, and disruptive integrations, while standing in a room full of high-voltage, mission-critical hardware he could not even begin to comprehend. Vance did not possess a single shred of foundational engineering knowledge. He could not tell the difference between a cooling manifold and a network switch if his life depended on it. To a man like Vance, the Aegis data center was just a magical, air-conditioned black box that printed money. He viewed the engineers not as the architects of his wealth, but as overly cautious mechanics who were just slowing down his grand vision. He did not understand that this black box was a delicate, dangerous ecosystem of raw electricity and volatile chemical coolants. He looked at my flawless safety record and did not see stability. He only saw untapped profit margins. His supreme arrogance was a disease, and his ignorance was about to become the most disastrous, humiliating, and expensive lesson of his entire privileged life, and I was going to be the one to teach it to him. The emergency summit was called at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday. The executive boardroom was a glass box floating above the main server floor, a pristine space that smelled of expensive cologne and misplaced confidence. Vance stood at the head of the long mahogany table, projecting a massive, brightly colored slideshow onto the smartboard. The title of the presentation was something agonizingly hollow like Synergizing the Future. "Harper," Vance began, leaning forward and steepling his fingers in a textbook display of manufactured authority. "I have been reviewing your operational parameters. Frankly, your approach is too safe and lacking in breakthrough innovation. We are sitting on a goldmine of raw processing power, and you are treating it like a fragile antique." I kept my expression entirely neutral, though my jaw tightened. The parameters are precisely set to ensure absolute stability for the Department of Energy grid allocations. We do not gamble with federal infrastructure. The margins for error are non-existent. Vance waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a minor annoyance. That is exactly the kind of legacy thinking we need to eliminate immediately. The board wants a massive funding round next month to get those venture capitalists salivating. We need unprecedented, explosive metrics. I want you to overclock the entire server fleet to 150% capacity starting next Monday. We need to show them a benchmark record that will absolutely break the industry. I stared at him, genuinely wondering if he was experiencing a cognitive break. "You cannot be serious," I said, sliding a thick, heavily tabbed stack of thermal physics reports across the table. "You cannot just turn a digital dial and manifest more computing power without a severe proportional increase in heat. If you force an overclock to 150%, the thermal output will instantly exceed the structural tolerance of the chemical coolant pipes. The internal pressure will spike beyond safe limits. The zinc linings will fracture, and the highly conductive liquid will flood the racks. You are going to cause a catastrophic burnout of the entire core server block." Vance did not even glance at the reports. He offered a condescending chuckle, looking around the room as if sharing a joke with an invisible audience. "Always the pessimist. Harper, you engineers get so bogged down in the doom and gloom of theoretical physics. You need to focus on aggressive solutions, not roadblocks, which is why I am making some necessary structural changes to the management team today." The glass door to the boardroom swung open. In walked a man who looked like he had just rolled off a yacht in Miami. He was wearing a pastel linen shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, paired with designer loafers and absolutely no socks. "This is Brody," Vance announced, clapping the newcomer enthusiastically on the shoulder. "Brody and I go way back to our fraternity days at university. He just made an absolute killing surfing the cryptocurrency waves last year. He understands aggressive, disruptive growth and high-risk tolerance, effective immediately. Brody is stepping in as our new Chief Operating Officer." Brody flashed a blindingly white, completely vacant smile. "Sup, team. Really stoked to be here. I was looking at the floor plan, and I think we can really pump these processing numbers up to the moon if we just get the right vibes flowing. You know, it is all about the hustle mindset." I felt a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach. A crypto day trader, whose only qualification was a shared college handshake, was now second in command of a facility handling autonomous vehicle telemetry and federal power grids. "Vance," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady, He has zero background in thermal dynamics, server architecture, or national cybersecurity. Vance's fake corporate smile vanished, replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer. Brody is here to supervise operations and put you in line. Harper, since you are so intensely fixated on archaic rules and regulations, I have decided to realign your role within the company. Hand over your security keys. I am revoking your core system administrative privileges. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He was locking me out of the very digital architecture I had built with my own 2 hands. Furthermore, Vance continued, his tone dripping with blatant malice, you are being reassigned to the role of Records Compliance Advisor. It is abundantly clear to me that you are better suited for cleaning up paperwork than engaging in high-level strategic thinking. Brody will take over the primary command console starting today. It was the ultimate, calculated humiliation. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to slam my fists on the mahogany table, throw my identification badge in his face, and storm out of the building in a righteous rage. Because if I quit, the aggressive vesting clause in my employment contract would trigger immediately. I would instantly forfeit hundreds of thousands of dollars in deferred stock options that I had earned through years of grueling, relentless labor. He wanted to strip me of my power, humiliate me in front of his friend, and steal my equity in one swift, cowardly move. But I did not give him the satisfaction. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not blink. I looked at Vance, then at Brody, taking in the full, terrifying measure of their profound stupidity. Understood, I said softly, allowing a slow, chilling smile to curve my lips. I will transition to my new role immediately. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked out of the glass boardroom without looking back. I descended to the main floor, entered the pristine control room one last time, and quietly packed my personal belongings into a small cardboard box. As I carried my things toward the windowless, damp storage closet they had designated as my new office, the anger inside me did not explode. Instead, it crystallized into something pure, sharp, and entirely focused. They thought they had neutralized me by shoving me into the dark. They had no idea. They had just handed me the exact tools and the perfect alibi I needed to engineer their absolute, inescapable destruction. My new workspace was a subterranean nightmare. It was a windowless, concrete storage closet tucked away in the deepest sub-basement of the facility, sandwiched between a noisy industrial elevator shaft and the main sewage lines. The air down there was thick, tasting faintly of mildew and ozone, and the only illumination came from a single, violently flickering fluorescent tube on the ceiling. Vance probably thought isolating me in this damp, miserable cage would break my spirit. He thought wrong. Stripped of my administrative access and isolated from the main floor, I had zero distractions. This miserable little room became my war room, and I was about to weaponize the very paperwork he had exiled me to manage. I began excavating the massive digital archives of our federal security contracts and the highly localized, incredibly strict fire safety certifications for the state of Texas. I spent 3 relentless days and nights poring over thousands of pages of dense legalese, cross-referencing Department of Energy mandates with state infrastructure protection laws. It was like picking the world's most complex digital lock, searching for a single, microscopic flaw in the architecture of their corporate hubris. On the morning of the 4th day, beneath a mountain of compliance addendums, I found it. It was a buried, highly specific clause regarding the classification of our facility as a critical national security asset. The language was absolute and unforgiving. It stated that any fundamental alteration to the hardware parameters or the thermodynamic cooling algorithms without the explicit cryptographically secured digital signature of a state-licensed chief system engineer would not just be considered a breach of contract. The Department of Energy would instantly classify it as a deliberate act of sabotage against the national power grid infrastructure. That was a federal crime, carrying penalties of severe prison time and catastrophic financial restitution. Vance and Brody were about to change the cooling and processing parameters. They did not have my signature. and Brody certainly did not have an engineering license. With the precision of a watchmaker building a bomb, I began drafting a document. I titled it the Operational Enhancement and Dynamic Parameter Revision Waiver. I structured it to look exactly like a standard, agonizingly boring internal compliance form. I flooded the pages with an ocean of impenetrable technical jargon, utilizing the most obscure thermodynamic theories and convoluted legal phrasing I could synthesize. But buried deep within the third section, hidden beneath layers of syllables designed to make a corporate executive's eyes glaze over, was the kill switch. The clause explicitly stated that the signatory acknowledged the override of the licensed engineer's safety protocols and voluntarily assumed 100% of the legal, criminal, and financial liability for any subsequent hardware failure, data loss, or infrastructural damage. By signing it, the individual was legally severing the company's liability and placing the entire burden squarely on their own personal, private assets and freedom. I printed the document, placed it in a sleek leather folder, and took the elevator up to the executive suite. Vance was lounging in his massive office, practicing his golf putt on a synthetic green mat while screaming at someone on his wireless headset. I stood quietly by the mahogany door until he finished his call and shot me a look of profound annoyance. "What do you want, Rivera?" he snapped, leaning on his putter. "Brody said you were busy organizing old tax receipts in the basement." "Brody is implementing your new overclocking mandate this Friday," I said, keeping my voice utterly flat and subservient. "Since I am no longer the active administrator, compliance requires a formal sign-off for the internal audit trail before the system accepts the new parameters. It is just standard procedural red tape to officially transfer the operational authority from my department over to yours." I opened the leather folder and placed the document on his glass desk, pointing to the glowing electronic signature pad at the bottom of the tablet. Vance sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes as if my adherence to the law was a personal insult to his genius. "This is exactly why tech companies stagnate," he muttered, tossing his putter aside. "Endless, pointless bureaucracy." He did not read a single sentence. He did not even scan the bolded headers. Driven by pure arrogance and his desperate need to push me out of his office, Vance grabbed the digital stylus. With a quick, illegible flourish, he applied his personal, legally binding cryptographic signature to the bottom of the screen. A green checkmark flashed, locking the contract into the immutable corporate ledger. He had just confidently slipped his head into the noose and handed me the lever to the trapdoor. "Are we done here?" Vance asked, shooing me away with the back of his hand. "Yes," I replied softly, taking the tablet back. "We are completely done here." But my revenge would mean nothing if innocent people suffered the consequences. Aegis Nexus held the data of major hospitals, power grids, and autonomous transit networks. I could not let Vance's idiocy cause a statewide blackout or crash cars on the highway. I retreated to my damp bunker and pulled out a personal, encrypted mobile device, completely disconnected from the company network. Over the next 48 hours, I reached out to my most trusted contacts. I made secure, off-the-record calls to the lead systems engineers at the Department of Energy and the senior data officers at our largest automotive clients. I could not tell them exactly what was about to happen, but in our industry, a quiet warning from a peer carries the weight of a tornado siren. I told them we were experiencing internal administrative turbulence and strongly advised them to initiate emergency data mirroring immediately. While Brody was busy trying to figure out how to bypass the basic firewall alerts on the main floor, completely oblivious to the network traffic, I guided our clients through the back channels. I helped them silently reroute and back up petabytes of their critical, redundant data to an independent, secure third-party server location. The clients were safe, the legal trap was set, signed, and time-stamped. All that was left to do was sit back in the dark and wait for the men upstairs to light the match. The execution of Vance and Brody's grand vision began with the systematic dismantling of common sense. Down on the main floor, the environment was shifting from a sanctuary of precision into a chaotic frat house. Brody paced behind the glass walls of the control room, an iced coffee in his hand, barking orders at the junior technicians. The initial stages of the server ramp-up were already causing micro-fluctuations in the heat sinks. Naturally, my meticulously coded automated warning systems responded exactly as they were designed to. A rhythmic, piercing klaxon began to sound, accompanied by flashing amber strobe lights, warning the staff that the core processors were heating up too quickly. Instead of investigating the thermal spikes, Vance marched down from his office, visibly irritated by the noise. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching him corner the lead shift technician. "Turn that obnoxious racket off right now," Vance demanded, waving his hands frantically. The technician, a brilliant but timid 23-year-old kid burdened with student debt, tried to explain that the alarms were hardwired safety mechanisms. Vance cut him off. "Those beeping error sounds are severely lowering the positive energy of this company. We are trying to build a culture of relentless optimism here. If you cannot disable the speaker, pull the fuse, just make it stop." Under the threat of immediate termination, the technician physically bypassed the alert board. The control room went silent, but the digital gauges continued to climb, ignored and suppressed. But turning off the alarms was only the beginning of their breathtaking incompetence. Brody, desperate to prove his worth as the new chief operating officer and show Vance a massive reduction in operational overhead, decided to audit our chemical supplies. For 5 years, we used a highly specialized, aerospace-grade dielectric fluid. It was expensive because it had a neutral acidity level, specifically engineered not to react with the miles of sensitive zinc-lined pipes running beneath the raised server floor. Brody found an alternative supplier on an online industrial wholesale board. To cut the budget by 60%, he unilaterally ordered 90 barrels of a cheap, unverified commercial coolant meant for heavy construction machinery. I watched from a secure security camera feed as the unmarked steel drums were rolled onto the loading dock. The new chemical was highly conductive and extremely corrosive. Pumping that cheap sludge through our delicate zinc manifolds was the chemical equivalent of pouring battery acid down your throat to quench your thirst. Yet, Brody forced the maintenance crew to drain the premium fluid and pump the corrosive, neon green liquid directly into the primary circulatory system. I did not intervene. I did not send a frantic email begging them to stop. Instead, I became a corporate ghost. While they were busy dismantling the very infrastructure that kept the building from catching fire, I moved silently through the facility, gathering my ammunition. I took high-resolution photographs of the cheap coolant barrels on the loading dock, making sure the hazardous material warning labels were perfectly legible. I covertly copied the purchase orders bearing Brody's signature. More importantly, I intercepted their internal communications. Brody was reckless, sending out company-wide memorandums demanding compliance with the new protocols. I captured every single email, every written coercive directive where Vance threatened to fire anyone who questioned the cooling swap or the alarm deactivation. I compiled all of it, the photographs, the purchase orders, the intimidating emails, into a deeply encrypted, heavily organized digital dossier. I ran the entire file through an independent blockchain notary service, stamping every single byte of data with an irrefutable, unalterable digital timestamp. The evidence was absolute. It painted a crystal-clear picture of gross, willful negligence orchestrated entirely by the executive team. By Thursday afternoon, the physical consequences of their ignorance began to manifest. The ambient temperature in the main server hall, which was strictly supposed to remain at a crisp 64 degrees Fahrenheit, had crept up to an alarming 82 degrees. You could feel the heat radiating through the reinforced glass. The atmosphere inside the facility grew heavy and oppressive. The ventilation system, struggling to compensate for the cheap, inefficient liquid running through the pipes, groaned under the strain. A disturbing, acrid scent began to permeate the corridors. It was the unmistakable, toxic odor of melting polymer wire insulation and scorching silicon. If you stood still in the center of the room, you could feel a deep, mechanical shudder vibrating up through the soles of your shoes. The zinc pipes beneath the raised floor panels were expanding and contracting violently as the corrosive coolant began eating away at the joints. The pressurized system was fighting a losing battle, groaning and rattling like a caged beast desperately trying to tear its way out. The facility was literally cooking itself alive. I walked back to my damp basement closet for the very last time. The air down there actually felt cool compared to the stifling heat building up on the floors above. I opened a small cardboard box and quietly packed away the last few personal keepsakes I had left. A framed photograph of my engineering graduating class, my lucky titanium wrench, a vintage schematic of the first motherboard I ever built. I taped the box shut and carried it up the back stairwell, bypassing the main lobby entirely. I stepped out into the blinding Texas sunlight. The oppressive heat of the afternoon felt entirely natural compared to the artificial inferno brewing inside Aegis Nexus. I popped the trunk of my car, placed the box inside, and closed it with a soft, satisfying click. I sat in the driver's seat, rolled down the window, and looked up at the massive, gleaming facade of the data center. Tomorrow was the day Vance planned to showcase his grand, overclocked achievement to the world. I leaned back against the leather headrest, crossed my arms, and began silently counting down the hours, waiting with perfect patience for the time bomb to finally explode. Friday morning brought the day of reckoning. Vance had transformed the secure observation deck, located just outside the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass walls of the main server room, into an extravagant, high-end cocktail lounge. He spared absolutely no expense for his grand theatrical debut. Caterers in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of imported champagne and artisan hors d'oeuvres. Dozens of heavy-hitting venture capitalists, key political figures from the Texas state legislature, and top-tier media representatives mingled on the plush carpets. They were all there to witness what Vance had aggressively marketed as an unprecedented leap forward in cloud computing architecture. I stood quietly near the back exit, nursing a glass of sparkling water, blending perfectly into the shadows of a large potted ficus. At exactly 10 in the morning, Vance stepped up to a sleek acrylic podium facing the glass wall. He tapped the microphone, flashing his signature million-dollar smile, and launched into a grandiose speech filled with his usual empty rhetoric about disrupting the status quo and redefining the boundaries of machine learning. Behind him, the colossal rows of servers hummed, already stressed and running dangerously hot under the strain of the inferior, corrosive coolant. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance announced, gesturing dramatically toward the massive glass partition. "Today, we are not just pushing the envelope, we are incinerating it. Aegis Nexus is about to demonstrate a processing speed that will completely rewrite the fundamental laws of data management. Brody, my chief operating officer, will now initiate the primary sequence. Let us show the world what true, unleashed power looks like." Vance turned and gave Brody a sharp, confident nod. Standing at the main control console right beside the podium, Brody grinned and dramatically slammed his hand down on the enter key, forcing the entire server fleet into a massive, unmitigated overclock. He commanded the system to instantly jump to 150% capacity. The catastrophe did not happen in slow motion. It was a violent, instantaneous chain reaction of pure, unforgiving physics. Deep beneath the raised floor panels, the cheap industrial coolant was already struggling. The moment the processors demanded a massive surge of raw electricity, the thermal output skyrocketed exponentially. The unverified chemical liquid could not absorb the sudden, extreme spike in temperature. Within a matter of seconds, the neon green sludge hit its boiling point. The transition from liquid to expanding vapor created a catastrophic buildup of kinetic pressure inside the degraded zinc pipes. The metal screamed. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek that echoed right through the reinforced glass and over the applause of the clueless investors. Then the main circulatory artery ruptured. It sounded like a mortar shell detonating inside a submarine. A massive, concussive boom shook the entire foundation of the building. The pressure tore a 3-foot gash straight through the primary cooling manifold. Hundreds of gallons of boiling, highly conductive chemical fluid erupted upward with the force of a geyser, violently blasting the steel floor tiles straight up into the air. The scalding liquid smashed directly into the towering racks of servers. These were thousands of exposed red-hot circuit boards instantly saturated in a highly reactive, conductive bath. The reaction was apocalyptic. Water and electricity are a dangerous combination, but boiling industrial sludge and high-voltage core processors create a terrifying explosive nightmare. A blinding cascade of bright blue electrical arcs shot across the room, illuminating the dark server hall like a frantic, artificial lightning storm. The overloaded capacitors began detonating one by one, popping like strings of violent, metallic firecrackers. Entire server racks short-circuited simultaneously, vomiting showers of molten copper and golden sparks into the aisles. In a properly functioning facility, the emergency fail-safes would have instantly severed the main power lines to prevent a fire. The automated system would have detected the thermal runaway and forcefully shut the grid down. But Vance had ordered those systems bypassed. He had explicitly instructed his technicians to kill the alarms to preserve his positive company culture. Because the digital klaxons were muted, the central operating system blindly continued to pump massive, lethal amounts of electricity into the drowning, burning hardware. Thick, oily, jet-black smoke immediately began pouring out of the shattered servers. It was a highly toxic cocktail of burning polymer, vaporized heavy metals, and searing chemical coolant. Within moments, the dense cloud hit the ceiling and was viciously sucked into the industrial ventilation ducts. Because the system thought everything was perfectly normal, it pumped that toxic smoke directly out through the climate control vents above the observation deck. The celebratory atmosphere on the VIP floor instantly vaporized into pure primal terror. The choking, acrid smoke rained down on the investors and state officials. The smell was unbearable, searing the lungs and burning the eyes. Panic erupted. Dozens of highly influential millionaires and politicians dropped their crystal champagne flutes and began screaming in absolute horror. It was a complete, undignified stampede. People violently shoved each other out of the way, trampling over fallen chairs and spilled caviar, desperately fighting to reach the emergency stairwells. The pristine glass walls were suddenly lit by the hellish orange glow of genuine fire breaking out among the server racks. Near the podium, the smug confidence had entirely melted off the faces of Vance and Brody. They were coughing uncontrollably, their eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. Brody was frantically hammering on the control console keyboard, his hands shaking violently. "Turn it off!" Vance shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically as he grabbed Brody by the collar. "Revert the system. Go back to the old algorithm. Put it back to Rivera's settings right now." Brody slammed his palms against the desk, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I cannot. The command prompts are dead. It is locking me out." I watched through the thinning crowd as Vance shoved Brody aside and desperately started typing himself, trying to rip back control of the monstrous inferno he had created. But my system was not just a passive piece of software. It was highly intelligent, and it was designed to protect the federal grid at all costs. Detecting massive, unauthorized hardware destruction and a barrage of erratic command inputs from a user with a fundamentally flawed cooling structure, the core architecture did exactly what it was programmed to do in the event of a severe cyber-physical attack. It engaged the ultimate defense protocol. The massive monitors hanging above the console flickered violently, overriding the useless metric graphs Vance loved so much. The screens went entirely black. Then, a single, massive string of text appeared across every single monitor in the room, glowing in an unforgiving blood-red hue. "Critical intrusion detected. All peripheral access denied. System engaging full lockdown." Vance stared at the glaring red letters, his jaw trembling, the reflection of his burning multi-million-dollar empire dancing in his eyes. He hammered the keyboard again, but it was just dead plastic. The system was completely sealed. There was no manual override, no backdoor access, and absolutely no way to stop the fire. He had demanded complete control, and in doing so, he had locked himself out of his own burning house. The heat was immense, the noise was deafening, and the disaster was absolute. I took one last, highly satisfying look at the chaos, turned on my heel, and quietly slipped out the back exit, leaving them to burn in the fire of their own supreme ignorance. The deafening wail of federal sirens shattered the Texas morning, entirely drowning out the chaotic screams of fleeing investors. I stood safely by the perimeter fence, holding a fresh cup of black coffee I had bought from the cafeteria across the street, watching the magnificent finale unfold. Dozens of heavily armored black utility vehicles and bright yellow hazardous materials response trucks swarmed the industrial complex. Armed agents wearing dark windbreakers emblazoned with the letters of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency kicked through the shattered glass doors. Flanked by teams in heavy full-body chemical suits, the Department of Energy's automated sabotage alerts had triggered an immediate maximum-level federal lockdown. The agents aggressively herded the surviving executives and choking staff members into the main parking lot. Vance emerged from the toxic smoke looking like a broken man. His expensive turtleneck was stained with soot, and his face was slick with terrified sweat. The moment his frantic eyes locked onto me, standing calmly by the fence, a desperate, cornered rage overtook him. He lunged forward, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "Arrest her!" Vance screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he desperately tried to flag down the lead federal investigator. "She is the chief architect. She built that cooling system. It was her fault she caused this leak, and she needs to go to federal prison for the rest of her life." I did not flinch. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I walked gracefully past Vance, stepped up to the hood of the lead investigator's cruiser, and pulled the sleek leather folder from my bag. I slammed it down onto the metal hood with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Actually, Agent," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for the entire crowd to hear, "I was officially demoted to Records Compliance Advisor last week. Here is the cryptographically secured, legally binding operational waiver. You will see it contains the authenticated digital signature of Chief Executive Officer Vance Sterling, wherein he voluntarily assumes 100% of the criminal, civil, and financial liability for manually overriding the licensed national security safety protocols." I slid the time-stamped dossier out of the folder, exposing the high-resolution photographs of the illegal chemical barrels, the receipts bearing Brody's signature, and copies of Vance's coercive emails demanding the deactivation of the fire alarms. Vance stared at his own digital signature glowing on the printed page. All the blood instantly drained from his face. His knees buckled as the sheer, crushing weight of federal treason charges hit him. The agents did not hesitate for a single second. They grabbed Vance by the shoulders, spun him around, and slammed him roughly against the side of the federal cruiser, locking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists while reciting his rights for domestic infrastructure sabotage. His venture capital fund was dead, destined to face billions of dollars in catastrophic lawsuits by the end of the week. But here is the ultimate twist of the knife. Despite the raging inferno destroying his hardware, not a single byte of critical client data was actually lost. The hospitals, the traffic grids, and the energy sectors were completely safe, running smoothly on the independent servers I had secured days ago. I turned my back on the flashing red and blue lights and walked away from the ruined empire. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, pulled out my mobile phone, and opened an encrypted document. With one smooth swipe of my finger, I officially authorized the incorporation of my very own proprietary cloud architecture firm. Every single major client who had quietly evacuated their data from Aegis Nexus over the last 48 hours had already signed exclusive, incredibly lucrative contracts with my new enterprise last night. I put the car in gear and drove away into the bright morning, leaving the ashes of my former boss behind, officially stepping into my new role as a fully autonomous, highly funded Chief Executive Officer. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners of the Boss Revenge Stories channel for tuning in until the very end. I would love to know, Where in the world are you listening to this story from today? Please let me know in the comments. If you found today's story entertaining and satisfying, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the direct PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous contribution directly pays the salaries of our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating and bringing you the best, highest quality revenge stories every single week. Stay safe and never let anyone underestimate your worth.